This project was supported by Award 15PJDP 22GK00946MUMU, awarded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and the Office of Justice Programs. The opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this videocast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of Justice. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Reflections on Research, the podcast all about mentoring and mentoring research for those of you who are interested in those things. I am Mike Geringer, the Director of Research and Evaluation at Mentor at our headquarters in Boston, and I am joined today by Katie Edwards, who is a member of our NMRC Research Board, and Katie is a professor at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. The Fighting Cornhuskers, which when I was about 10 years old was my absolute favorite football team in the whole universe, although that did not go over well considering I lived in Iowa and all my family were Hawkeyes people. So I was ostracized for many years thinking about the Big Red Machine. But welcome, Katie. You're a professor in the Center for Research on Children, Youth, Families, and Schools. So a nice combination of topics there that you work on. And you've done a number of things over the years, research around all kinds of issues that affect young people, things like intimate partner violence and sexual assault and dating violence and the needs of LGBTQ youth in communities. But also you have some expertise, I think partially based just because of where you're at, on rural youth. And so we'll kind of touch on all of those topics in this conversation today. So thank you for joining us, Katie.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Mike.
So I want to start with a pretty basic question I've asked all my guests this year. How did you get into doing research around mentoring? As I just said, you've got a number of interests in your research background, not directly tied to mentoring, some of them, but I'm just curious how you stumbled into the world of mentoring. Was this something that you always knew you wanted to study? Did you just kind of find your way into it? What's your origin story in this work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think there's been a shift in the field in violence prevention and really moving away just from the individual and really thinking about the communities they're part of, the groups they're part of, and the adults in their lives. And so, we did a study a couple years ago where we actually found that youth who had an important adult had lower rates of violence that they experienced. And that really even further increased my interest in really starting to think about what is the role of adults in prevention. And so how can we include adults in prevention with youth that's focused around violence prevention? And so that's really kind of what spawned it. And I think it's just something that my research is doing more and more, is really looking at the role of adults. Sometimes that's caregivers and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's mentors, and it can be both too, right? And so and what we are finding in our work preliminarily is that mentors can make an impact and do make an impact across a number of domains, and including violence related outcomes. And so that's one of the things that we're increasingly looking at in our research.
That's cool. Yeah, everyone I've asked that question to this year, they all say, well, I was kind of studying this other aspect of young people's lives and kind of realized that mentoring could be a thing that is applied to addressing that other need. And
Absolutely.
really speaks to the flexibility of this form of helping people. I think the beauty of mentoring is it can really be applied to just about any need or any kind of behavior a young person wants to change. So
yeah, and I think too, when we really think about prevention, like it's really important that we think about de-siloing prevention. So rather than a prevention program for violence, a prevention program for substance use, a prevention program for dropout, like what are some of the strategies we can use, right? Because we don't have time for a kid to have every program, right, for everything. And mentoring, I think, is actually one of those things, right? And we know that things like violence school dropout, substance use, mental health, those things also co-occur a lot. And so I think one of the really exciting things about mentoring is that it holds great promise, I think. And I mean, there's research, of course, with other outcomes. I think the violence, particularly like the dating sexual violence, is a newer outcome, but something that I think is really important for us to measure and to understand what are maybe some of those mechanisms that through which mentoring can lead to reductions in violence and overall positive youth development, which includes having healthy relationships with other people.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, those reductions in violence are certainly top of mind for JJDP and many of the folks that work kind of on the intervention side of this as well, trying to get young people to maybe, regulate their emotions or think a little differently before taking some action that they will regret later, for sure. I wanted to talk with you about something that's been top of mind for me for about, ever since the start of the year, when Mentor put out this big research study called Who Mentored You, which basically asked Americans kind of, did you have a mentor growing up? And if so, who was that person? And if you didn't have one, kind of, would you have liked one? And all these ways of looking at whether young people are getting mentoring or not. And one of the unfortunate things we found was that youth in rural communities, folks who grew up in rural spaces, were often reporting having far fewer mentors than kids in suburban and urban settings. And so you recently had authored, along with Dr. Crystal Aschenbrenner, a review of the research on what we know about mentoring, supporting rural youth, how it's best delivered, what rural youth tend to get out of these relationships. I guess a good starting point would be, when you looked really closely at that research, what surprised you about it? What kind of jumped out to you as maybe something you didn't know about mentoring in rural youth?
Yeah, I think the first thing that jumped out to me was how little we know, right? I mean, in terms of what's documented. I mean, I feel like when we were doing that review, we were absolutely looking at like published like journal articles, but a lot of it was like spent on Google, like what's out there.
Yeah.
And really trying to understand the scope of what are the types of mentoring opportunities for youth in rural communities. And it was really hard to get a really clear sense because there just wasn't a lot of documented research out there. I think the other thing that stood out is the barriers, that there are really unique and significant barriers to mentoring. I think, when we think of the vastness of some rural areas and communities, I mean, a mentor could live, in the same kind of geographic area, but it could be an hour away,
Yeah.
right? I'm thinking of some of the places I work in South Dakota. I mean, some kids may go 30 to 40 minutes to school.
Yeah.
So thinking about some of the barriers and weather and transportation, but I think the other thing is that there is stuff happening. I mean, despite those barriers, like there was definitely evidence that a number of communities that it's happening in formal context and often in informal context. And I think that informal piece is really important. And when we think about it, really any adult can be a mentor, right? And so in some ways, like how can we get information about informal mentoring out, and of course formal mentoring to rural communities, but because some of the literature there was actually focusing on the role of teachers or a coach or a youth
Yeah.
minister, and how those people actually had significant impacts on the lives of kids. So those were some of the things that stood out. And then also creative ways, thinking about, online mentoring. Are there ways, again, I know that there's Wi-Fi bandwidth issues, but also if there's programming funds, is there a way to get a kid a Wi-Fi stick and a tablet so that they do have access to, a mentor? And so like really thinking about it and thinking about it from a cost perspective, right? Like we know that yes, a tablet and a Wi-Fi stick costs money, but if we think about preventing rape that costs over $200,000 in a lifetime, Wi-Fi stick and a tablet are cheaper. So
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
definitely. Yeah, I think when I looked at that review, I was also struck by some of the strengths that rural communities bring to this work, right? So they often have an abundance of kind of outdoor things to do that city folks often don't have access to. those communities can be close knit in a way, and that if there is a need to bring adults in to volunteer, there's often a tradition of everyone pitching in to help. So, and I was also struck by there was just the diversity within rural communities. I believe you noted that there was something like several thousand census tracts that are rural, where they're majority minority, where people of color are actually the dominant demographic group. And so, it kind of shifted my thinking a little bit about what are we talking about when we talk about rural
Yeah.
spaces. I think I had something in my mind that was a little more Midwestern traditional rural Iowa, which is where I'm from, kind of. But
Yeah.
I was struck by the diversity kind of in those communities and the uniqueness of them. So,
Absolutely, which I think is important, right? That it means that what works in one rural community may not work in another rural community from, from a mentoring perspective. And so I think that's where, is important to think about. Um, and I think you're right that what mentoring looks like in New York City may be really different than what it looks like in, rural Mississippi or rural Wyoming, right? Thinking about like
yeah,
the context of that, I think is really important, and what kids enjoy, doing, and how can, I mean, that was one barrier that came up that I recall, is that like not knowing what to do in some rural communities, like what are we going to do, right?
yeah,
And so that was something that I think that came up, and I think that comes up in all, mentoring relationships. I mentor a youth here through Big Brothers and Big Sisters in Lincoln, and she, frequently,
yeah.
we live in Lincoln and usually wants to do the same two things. So
Yeah,
yeah,
sometimes it depends on the young person you're
it
matching with
totally
too.
does.
How adventurous are they?
It does. Yeah.
Uh, yeah, you also in that review touched on the fact that a lot of the models that we have and kind of the research, and everyone wants to do like an evidence informed or based program model, but those are all urban models for the most part. That's kind of what's been studied, and I think it's really challenging to take something that was designed to work in a large urban area and translate that to a more rural space. Maybe that's a good segue into my next question was, now that you've kind of looked at that body of literature, what do you think is most important for people who work in mentoring in rural communities to kind of know? Were there kind of big conclusions that, you felt like, oh, I really want to tell this to the practitioners, or maybe even to funders? Is there something funders and policymakers should be paying attention to on that, based on that research?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think for sure, like, I mean, I think from the funding perspective is, really getting resources into rural communities. I mean, I know that there's some money that's earmarked for that, and I think that's really important. Substantial number of youth live in rural communities, and I think,
Yep.
all youth need, supports and mentors. And I think we really need to make sure that youth in rural communities are getting access to that. I think, um, for funders, thinking also too about how can we make organizations able to actually apply for these grants. I mean, I pro bono write grants for people in rural organization and rural communities as much as I can, because they don't often have the infrastructure. If you think about all the things required for a grant, and so I think especially in rural communities where there's like already a lack of infrastructure, thinking about how can we make that grant writing process as easy as possible,
Yep.
so that those organizations actually can do it, because it can be a really intimidating, overwhelming, and for some organizations just not a doable process. Yeah. And I think for practitioners, I think thinking strategically, again, without large grants, like how can we do these things on a shoestring budget? And, I mean, one of the things about a lot of communities, including rural communities, that people often come together for kids, and thinking about what are some of the ways that we can leverage, sense of community, the kind of rally around supporting kids in our community to do some of these mentoring activities, and think about doing them rather than being this standalone thing. Like how can we do it through an existing church or a school, and who might be willing to, volunteer so that, but not also have 10 mentees, right? Like, so it's feasible. So I think getting creative and thinking about ways to really leverage strengths that are already within a community, organizations that have capacity, even if a little or a few coming together, I think is a good way to start. And really you know, supporting mentors in that process too, right? I think that's another piece that we have to really make sure that mentors feel supported and what they're doing and how to be an effective mentor and so forth.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned kind of providing extra kind of capacity support to practitioners and to mentors. I mean, you're right. If I'm a mentor in a big city program, I probably have some kind of, mentor support group thing where I can meet up with other mentors and talk about how it's going, or we've got ongoing trainings, and and even mentoring professionals. I think they just have access to a wide array of kind of professional development offerings. But it's harder and more expensive to bring that to rural spaces. But I think there's a real equity reason to do it, right? The kids in rural communities deserve just as high quality mentoring experiences as any other young person in this country. And so I know we think about that on the NMRC side of things for providing training and TA, and really dedicating funds so that folks can travel out to those spaces and be kind of in those communities and work more directly with practitioners.
Right.
Um,
Absolutely.
I wanted to ask about a special aspect of doing mentoring in rural spaces, and that is the need to kind of provide support for young people that can sometimes be marginalized in rural communities. I'm thinking LGBTQ plus youth, immigrant youth. I know in Nebraska you've had a large influx of immigrants working in more agricultural communities in the state. There's many other just kids with disabilities. You talked in the evidence review about kind of, the need, or at least some evidence that mentoring in those spaces can be really supportive of young people experiencing marginalization in those communities. I was hoping you could maybe talk a little bit about, kind of how mentors help those young people and the need to kind of make sure that we're providing that to young people in those communities.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. Sure. So we know that LGBTQ plus youth in any community, right? Just like any youth needs to feel supportive and affirmed. We do know from research that LGBTQ plus youth in rural communities do face additional stressors and report more, negative experiences in terms of like bullying and discrimination than in urban communities. And so, I think that within rural communities, it's really important, that those youth have access to adults who are affirming and who support them and who don't judge them, right? I mean, that's what all youth want, right? Is to feel accepted and loved and cared for, and that they're okay. And I think that youth in all communities need that, and that that youth in rural communities who often are minoritized, that they may have a harder time finding access to that. And so I think, really thinking about ways that we can support all youth, including youth who we know are facing additional adversities, is really important.
Thank you. And you'd mentioned the role of technology potentially in this too. I mean, I'm assuming that you would be a big proponent of bringing more e-mentoring to those communities. I mean, given that almost by default there is a limited number of adults available in rural spaces. So I think there's a lot of potential there to connect young people with different types even of adults than the ones who live in their community through technology. I don't know if you've worked with programs that are doing that kind of thing, but sometimes the barriers is, do they have the technology? I know that there's been a long push to bring high-speed broadband to every corner of the country, but that costs a lot of money. I don't think we've quite paid for that quite yet, but
Yeah,
maybe someday, because I think that would help.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and we're doing this in some of our research now, where we're doing online interventions, including online mentoring programs for all youth. But we're really doing like kind of over targeting or over sampling, so to speak, youth in rural communities where we know that they have often don't have access to mentoring programs, especially for youth who do have more minoritized social identities. And so, so we are doing that. Certainly there are Wi-Fi broadband issues. And we do know that that is a reality. And so, trying to find creative ways around that. We've even had some youth who've been able to get like a little private meeting room in the local library to do this.
Yep.
So they've been able to like, go to a friend's house and borrow like a tablet and like hang out in the unused room. So, we've tried to work with youth on like kind of creative ways to do this if they don't have like their own access to that in the home. And so, which is a real issue, but it is something that I think is helping to, I think it can definitely help reduce some of those barriers. For youth where, maybe the closest place, like the closest mentoring organization is an hour away, or maybe it's 30 minutes away, or maybe it's next door, but they don't feel like that is maybe the best fit for them, especially if they're wanting, a specific type of mentor or mentoring experience that may not be
Yeah.
available in their community.
Yeah, well, that access to subject matter expertise. I was at a conference once,
Yeah.
a Canadian researcher had talked about these programs way up north in Canada, where there's not very many people. And was able to connect classrooms of kids to historians at a university that was hundreds of miles away, and these kids were getting real deal help from scholars that they never would have been able to meet or work with in person. So when it can be built, I think it's powerful stuff. um, I wanted to circle back to kind of where we started this conversation and ask a little bit about some of your other work around kind of intimate partner violence and youth violence more generally. What are the connections that you've seen in your work between mentors and kind of these relationships, helping young people avoid some of those mistakes, right? And learning to control kind of their emotions, their anger, getting out of these terrible situations where they wind up hurting somebody that they care about. What should the mentoring field know about that side of your work?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think, there's a couple things. I mean, I think, we do know that youth who, um, that have an adult, right, who can have conversations with them about what is healthy and what's unhealthy, right? I mean, it never ceases to surprise me when I'm with youth and, they're like, oh, my boyfriend loves me so much, he asks for all the passwords. I'm like, no. So, I mean, to me, like having a mentor and saying like, let's talk about that a little bit more, right? And let's talk about what's healthy and not. Or, um, when youth are feeling really strong emotions like anger, how do they manage that? Like having a mentor who can give them skills that they can use, right? And I think too, one of the things that I see a lot is that um, that youth who feel the youth who really have a really strong sense of feeling alone in this world, the youth who don't feel like they matter, they don't have a strong sense of self-worth. Those are youth that are often really, really vulnerable to being victimized and really vulnerable to being in abusive, exploitative relationships. And having a mentor who cares for them, who supports them, who helps them to see that they have intrinsic value and that they matter, and that they deserve respect. I mean, that's huge, I mean, that is so huge, for kids, especially for kids who don't have anyone else in their life telling them that.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that, I mean, that's such a huge protective factor for victimization. So I think there's a lot of, and then talking to youth about how you can help, like if you're with a mentee and they're like, oh yeah, I totally saw, this girl hit her boyfriend across the head. Like, oh, really? Well, what did you do? Like, how can we, so to me, there's like so many entry points of conversation that can help, with like community-wide change through like bystanders that can help reduce victimization, that can help reduce perpetration. Of course, kids are often both, kids who are victimized are often perpetrators, vice versa, right? And I don't even like the word perpetration because it can sound really like dehumanizing when we're talking about like a 14-year-old who's got some real bad stuff going on. But anyways, I think there's so many ways that mentors can help build that sense of identity, that's really healthy, that's so protective against violence, and also giving them skills to navigate really complicated issues that often happen within relationships. And,
Yeah.
they might, in schools, kids may get like, like a health class on managing emotions or dating relationships, but it's just there's not often a lot that schools even have time to do, that varies a lot. And so I think, mentors have a real role to play in helping support kids across a number of domains, including, having healthy relationships, which is kind of a foundation on which, we need to function in life. So
all things stem from that.
yeah.
Yeah, and I'm guessing mentors, in addition to just having conversations and helping young people kind of figure out their own feelings about these topics, just role modeling sometimes what healthy behavior looks like, right? If your own home is maybe not a very healthy or functional place, maybe coming over and spending some time at your mentor's house and seeing a different way of being and living, and what a healthy, kind of relationship looks like with a partner. Sometimes the seeing is as much as important as the talking about it part.
Absolutely.
Last question for you here before we wrap is kind of what's next for you and your research. Do you have any cool studies coming up that you think our viewers would want to know about?
Yeah, we have a lot of cool studies, that are going on, and some that aren't final yet, but I will say include online, testing out some different kind of approaches to mentoring, including online mentoring, which I'm pretty excited about, and really looking at particularly how can we reach youth in these rural, remote locations, and how can we match them with mentors with similar social identities, lived experiences. And so I'm pretty excited about some of that upcoming work, and all the other work that we're doing. It's all great.
Oh, that's great. Well, and yeah, and I mean that shared or similar lived experience, that idea of a credible messenger. We often think about that in kind of a juvenile justice context, maybe someone who was in the trouble with the law when they were a kid or something, but it could apply to any aspect of life or one's identity, sense of self.
Yes.
And I'm really glad you mentioned the identity and belonging piece a few minutes ago. That same study I mentioned earlier, where we asked 4 generations of Americans, what did your mentor do that was meaningful to you? And the number 2 thing on that list was they helped me understand who I was. And number 4 on that list was they helped me build my sense of belonging and made
Huge.
me feel like I had a place in this world. And so for any child who doesn't have that, like those seem like foundational things that a mentor could help with.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
well, I do have one more goofy question, and that is our bonus question that I am asking all of my guests this season. And that is, it's a variation on the classic, if you could invite 4 famous people from history to dinner with you, except I don't really care so much about who the 4 people are, although you can tell me if you want. What I really want to know is what's the meal you're making for these people, and what music do you have playing in the background?
Oh my gosh. So I feel like I have unpopular music, so I'd probably let my wife pick out whatever playlist she would want to have, because people tend to like her music. It's like hip, and I'm not hip. And neither of us
Fair
really
enough.
cook. Neither of us like cook. So if we would maybe cater something, but I definitely would have like probably my favorite food, like an ice cream, maybe like a make your own ice cream sundae bar or something like that.
Nice.
I mean, that's fun.
Yeah, that does sound fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're the second person out of 3 that's mentioned wanting to just get catering because they're like, I don't want to.
It's like, oh my gosh. Yeah, we had a cookout the other week. I was asking like all the grad students and postdocs, like, do you all want to go bowling? Do you want to go in an escape room, a cookout? And they're like, we want to have a cookout at your house. I'm like, okay, awesome. It's like a big lab. There's like 20, 30 people coming. And like we were like, we don't even have a grill. So we found someone who would like come and like cater and do it all, the backyard barbecue for us.
Nice, nice.
So
Well, yeah,
yeah.
no, my last interview, Christian also mentioned doing some barbecue, but he wanted his dad to prepare it all. He's like, my dad's
Aw.
barbecue is near and dear to my heart. So I'm like, all right, I'll allow it. although your 4 guests from history may judge you for not cooking for them, but well, good answer, Katie. Appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today. I appreciate everything you've done for the NMRC project. You've been a fantastic addition to our research board, and look forward to working with you on many exciting things. And when all these cool new studies come out, we'll make sure we talk about them through the NMRC as well. So
That sounds great. Well,
thank
thank you
you for
having me.
everything, and thank you for watching today, and we'll see you next time on Reflections on Research. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Mike.